I really sincerely thank Father David McCown for all of his efforts to arrange this talk. And I also wanted to point out that I'm very grateful to him for the work he's doing in Africa and his bringing to that continent a different example of the American people and our capacity, one that will contrast with the one I'm presenting tonight, which is the American people's ability to invent ever more troubling ways of killing each other. So my topic tonight, attack drones, killer robots, and cyber weapons, will depart somewhat from talks I've given in recent years with a singular focus on attack drones. I really want to add to that talk I've been giving. I think people are not as aware as I would like them to be about the range of negative consequences from America's long-standing, now since 2001, use of attack drones. It's my thesis today that in addition to killing many people who should never have been subjected to intentional killing, causing a great deal of hatred and other problems, in addition to those negative and counterproductive effects of illegal killing, the U.S. government, our military, and the military-industrial complex have taken their experience with drones and have now set about to create the next generation of drones, calling them drones on steroids. And this is the fully autonomous robotic weapon. The philosopher Robin Sparrow of Australia has called this new invention the killer robot. And these robots are being developed so that they have a learning capacity, that they will be able to go out into the field, into other countries, into our own country, and on their own computer programs make the selection of a target and the decision to execute the person targeted without any human being making any addition to that action other than the original programming of the computer. The scientists say there will be no humans in the kill chain. The other area where extraordinary efforts are being made at the present time is in the invention of cyber weapons. These are computer programs that have the potential to turn a nuclear power plant, a hydroelectric dam, an airplane, and the like into explosive devices or weapons, with all the consequences that you can imagine. So my remarks will outline for you what international law says in general about killing with any of these inventions, drones, robots, or cyber. And I want to also add what it should say going forward as these new inventions come online in terms of what our basic morality, our shared sense of common decency says about killing. The American Catholic bishops are on record as demanding that the use of all lethal weapons and devices comply with human rights law and with law generally. And I'm praying fervently that Pope Francis, of whom I am a fan, as Father David said, will tell President Obama they're about to meet that in fact it is not only unlawful but immoral to kill people in the ways that the U.S. has been killing people for the last 12 and a half years. I very much hope, though, that the Pope is well informed on this issue, that he knows really the basic international law on this question. I'm finding too many UN investigators and international lawyers have stopped short of telling the United States to actually end killing with drones. They seem to be asking for more information. But I'm hoping you're going to conclude with me by the end of this talk that we really don't need additional information to demand an end of killing with drones and an end to the invention of yet more ways to kill that have the potential of seducing our political leaders into using military force in situations where, without this technology, they never would have engaged in killing. Let's start the discussion by having an overview, some more detail about the inventions that I'm talking about, and then we'll turn to the law, the politics or political theory, and psychology of killing. Arguably, the first major revolution in military affairs since the invention of the nuclear weapon is owed to the computer. Computers have revolutionized warfighting in many ways, but computer-controlled unmanned launch vehicles are the weapons part of the revolution. The U.S. developed a drone at the end of World War II, or soon thereafter, and drones were used for reconnaissance with a camera attached in Vietnam, the Gulf War, the Balkans, and in all wars since. The first use of a drone, a remotely piloted launch vehicle, in a lethal operation, the first time in which this vehicle that could be piloted from thousands of miles away had missiles attached to it to carry out an actual killing, occurred in November 2001 in the war in Afghanistan. In November 2002, a very different killing operation took place. The CIA carried out killings using a drone that they operated based in the African country of Djibouti. The drone flew in Yemen, and the missiles attacked a car in Yemen and killed all 6 passengers in the car, including a 23-year-old from Lackawanna. There was no armed conflict ongoing in Yemen at the time that the CIA carried out this killing. There had been no attack on the United States in preparation or in anything close, and yet this killing took place. In 2004, the CIA began the next campaign of targeted killing, and this was in Pakistan. And in late 2006, in what was probably a joint CIA and military operation, similar drone attacks began in Somalia. As we speak, new drone bases are on the drawing board, where the Los Angeles Times reported that the U.S. is looking for a place to have a drone base so that when our troops draw down in Afghanistan, they can continue drone operations, probably into Afghanistan, but definitely into Pakistan. They're looking in a number of Central Asian countries for this prospect. So this killing that we've been seeing since 2001 can be expected to go on in the future. According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, by the end of 2013, the U.S. had killed as many as 4,115 people beyond any armed conflict zones outside Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. Among that 4,115 people, over 200 were children. Now, the Obama administration has tried to characterize these U.S. drone attacks as lawful, and they have invoked as many as 6 distinct but often contradictory or irrelevant justifications. The administration's lawyers, in my careful analysis, close analysis, seem to be piling on a lot of weak arguments, hoping to present to the public something that altogether, taken altogether, looks persuasive. These lawyers very likely know that under international law, you cannot resort to military force, and that is what the drone-launched Hellfire missile is. It is military force. The Hellfire, which is the only type of missile that our drone fleet uses, was designed originally to destroy tanks. So it is not the weapon of a policeman, it is only the weapon of our military. Under international law, to deploy that kind of military force outside the United States, the U.S. needs at least one sufficient basis under international law. You can't roll together a group of weak arguments and have one justification. I often think that the president and his lawyers who keep presenting yet another argument, perhaps because they realize how weak each one ends up sounding to the United States public and to the world, that somehow if they have enough of these weak arguments, maybe our allies, maybe countries around the world will say, all right, the U.S. gets a pass, we're trying hard, and so therefore we'll get some kind of exception for doing this. But I also think by now, both the very serious negative consequences of the U.S.'s drone campaign and the fact that we are watching international law being weakened, the arguments against the use of military force, which we're trying to use with Russia today, are looking very unpersuasive to many countries, as the U.S. Is there, as President Obama tries to say to Mr. Putin, you are violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries, when it's obvious to most around the world that that is what the U.S. is doing. So let me spend a little bit of time on these weak arguments, so you'll see the basis of my position. And I'll start with the first argument, which was developed by the Bush administration. The Bush administration had only one argument. They didn't have all six that President Obama by now has. The Bush administration really only had one argument, and it was used to justify a number of what I think we all generally agree are unlawful policies following the 9/11 attacks. It was one argument that we were involved in a global war on terror, and it was used to justify detaining people all over the world, and from Malawi, from Algeria, from Pakistan, and putting them in secret prisons, these black sites that we operated in such places as Poland, in addition to the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base prison. It was the basis for which we used harsh interrogation tactics, that we developed these military commissions for having trials of persons, and it was the basis for drone attacks outside armed conflict zones. It was the global war on terror. Now, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said after 9/11 that everything had changed and that the U.S. was simply fighting a war on a new kind of battlefield, and that on these new battlefields we had the right to kill, to detain, and to try under military commission rules. But this new battlefield was not the place that international law recognizes as a battlefield, a place where organized armed groups are engaged in fighting. For the Bush administration, a battlefield was any place where an individual suspected of being connected with Al-Qaeda or other militant groups was located. It could be one person. And then that was, for the Bush administration, a battlefield. The one positive thing I will say about the Bush administration's argument about global war on terror is that at least they were consistent. They took this position on 9/11 and they saw it through for their entire 8 years. They were so consistent that in one of the many legal cases that they tried to defend in U.S. federal courts, when the judge said, "Do you mean to tell me if an elderly lady in Switzerland writes a check for an Islamic charity, and it turns out that that Islamic charity is involved in some kind of militancy, that the U.S. has the right to kill her without warning?" And the lawyers did not hesitate, and they said, yes, she is an enemy combatant. So I will say at least the Bush administration was consistent. The outrage over such an absurd position was really very slow outside the country and really within the U.S. I think most people, most international lawyers around the world were very focused on Afghanistan, and they were not noticing these kinds of arguments being made. And of course there was a lot of focus on Guantanamo Bay, but the black sites and the use of harsh interrogation was kept secret. It was hard to get the information out, so it was a while. And then on Afghanistan, the general view was that the United States was fighting lawfully. I think we now have more questions about that, but generally the view was, where the main action was happening in Afghanistan, that the U.S.'s actions were lawful. So in Afghanistan, the U.S.'s claim was that we were resorting to major military force, drones, and of course large numbers of ground troops, manned planes, and so on, because we were fighting in a war of self-defense. That, of course, the United Nations Charter in Article 2, Paragraph 4, prohibits resort to military force. It's a general prohibition. It requires states to settle their disputes peacefully. But if a state is the victim of an armed attack, a significant armed attack, Article 51 of the UN Charter says that if an armed attack occurs, a state may defend itself, and that means using military force on the territory of another state. But international law says that other sovereign state must be responsible, legally responsible, for the attack that triggers the right to use force in self-defense. So this is Article 2.4, Article 51. And international law does not stop there. The right of self-defense is very narrow for states, as it is for individuals. If you are defending yourself from somebody attacking you, you can only use that much force necessary to defend yourself. And that's the same rule in international law. It's from the just war doctrine that you must use force only if it's a last resort, you have no other choice, and only to the extent that you're accomplishing your defensive purpose in doing so. That's the principle of necessity. But also from the just war doctrine is the principle of proportionality. So even if you've made the case that it might be necessary, you have to think to yourself, am I going to do more harm in using force to defend my nation, kill more people, destroy more homes, destroy more natural habitat, then I will gain in defensive purpose in the defense of my nation. If you can't do so proportionately, if you're going to violate the principle of proportionality, again, international law says a use of force in that context would be unlawful. Well, the United Kingdom made the argument that the Taliban government in Afghanistan in 2001 was legally responsible for the 9/11 attacks because they were so closely intertwined with Al-Qaeda, which had actually carried out the attacks. We now know that from some excellent research by people like Lawrence Wright in his excellent book, The Looming Tower, that the ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were probably not close enough to make that legal case. That was unclear when the US and the UK resorted to force in self-defense on October 7th, 2001. But regardless, by December, when the Taliban had fallen and were no longer in control of Afghanistan, the U.S. basis for a war of self-defense had ended. And in my own view, we fought too long and should have left, certainly by December. We then ended up, we were no longer in a war of self-defense, but we were fighting to keep Mr. Karzai in power. It became a war an anti-insurgency war in which the U.S., at the invitation of Mr. Karzai, was seeking to keep the Taliban out of power and keep Mr. Karzai in. But this discussion of self-defense, I hope, has made clear to you that all of those detailed connections and bases for an argument for self-defense in Afghanistan certainly do not apply in Yemen, in Somalia, or in Pakistan. Even, however, in Afghanistan, I've come to a very different view about the use of drones from October 7th forward until today. Of course, we were dropping bombs and using missiles from piloted planes, so why not from unmanned aerial vehicles? There's always something problematic about actually hunting down and killing a named individual, even on the battlefield. That is very unusual, despite the rhetoric we've been hearing recently. The real point of modern use of force and law of self-defense is force versus counterforce. It's not about finding an individual. Our first drone strike with a Hellfire missile was in November 2001 against a named individual associated with Al-Qaeda, a man named Atef. He was in a building somewhere and apparently not part of the ongoing force, counterforce effort that we were undertaking more largely in Afghanistan. So I'm increasingly concerned about this focusing on an individual. But the other problem that we're having, certainly today and since 2002 when President Karzai took over in Afghanistan, is that he has long said you don't win an insurgency war, a civil war, if you kill lots of civilians, if you are destroying homes, if you're having this kind of impact within a civil war. And he has told the U.S. time and again, we must have a zero tolerance of civilian deaths. So every time the U.S. has refused to comply with Mr. Karzai's direction for how his war, his civil war, should be carried out, I think we have to question those attacks, whether from drones or other means. But my most serious reason for reconsidering even drone attacks in Afghanistan came to light in February 10th, 2014. I hope many of you saw the article published by Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept, an article called The NSA's Secret Role in the U.S. Assassination Program. I will quote from that article. The NSA often locates drone targets by analyzing the activity of a SIM card rather than the actual content of the calls. Based on a former drone operator's experience, he came to believe that the drone program amounts to little more than death by unreliable metadata. Quote, people get hung up that there's a targeted list of people, he says. It's really like we're targeting a cell phone. We're not going after people, we're going after their phones in the hopes that the person on the other end of that missile is a bad guy. We are using that kind of technology, not just for Yemen, not just for Somalia, not just for Afghanistan, not just for Pakistan, but Afghanistan as well. There is no right under the Geneva Conventions, under any principles of war fighting, that you can kill a suspect on the information that they're holding a particular phone. And of course, you all have already realized the problem with that. How many times have you handed your cell phone to a friend, or to your children, or you left it behind at the house? If that's what they're targeting for strikes, this has nothing to do with international law or with basic moral understanding. But let's move beyond Afghanistan and the unpersuasive global war on terror argument. I mean, President Obama understood we were not in a global war on terror, and he has put forward other arguments. And one of my main critiques of him is that his arguments are not even consistent one with the other. Let's just focus on two tonight, the two that most come up in conversation. One is that the U.S. is actually exercising its right of self-defense in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, beyond Afghanistan. And the other, inconsistently, is that we have the consent of those governments to carry out drone attacks. Let's use the example of Anwar al-Awlaki. I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He was a United States citizen. He was a Muslim cleric. He was living in Yemen, and in September 2011, he was killed by a drone strike along with 4 other individuals, another U.S. citizen, who were there with him. Now, in 2011, there was no real government in Yemen. It was the time between when Saleh had fled and was in Saudi Arabia and before his chosen successor, Hadi, had come into power. So we can't really talk about consent there. But even if we could, even if there was Yemeni consent to kill this individual. How could the Yemenis consent to the use of military force on their territory against a person, a human being on their territory, when they were not themselves involved in any military action? There was no insurgency, there was no civil war. They were under human rights obligations to use police methods to end lawlessness and violence. They couldn't consent to the U.S. using more military force than the government itself had the right to do. And of course, if we're looking for consent of Yemen, then where's the argument that we were using military force in self-defense against Yemen? That's got to be against Yemen. There had been no, but we couldn't use self-defense, the argument of self-defense against Yemen. Yemen itself as a country has never attacked the United States, not the country itself of Yemen, and that the attack has to be occurring. Now, the Obama administration has said we have a right to use military force in self-defense if an attack is imminent. And in their infamous memo that they wrote, the targeted killing memo, which was leaked to the press in February 2012, they said that imminent doesn't have to mean right away. It could mean sometime in the future. So that was obviously to cover, this memo was written specifically to justify the killing of Mr. Al-Awlaki, since he was a U.S. citizen. Well, okay, say no more about whether the armed attack is occurring or is even imminent, if that was allowed under international law. But the carrying out of the kinds of things that Mr. Al-Awlaki was connected with, 2 failed attempts to put explosive devices on airplanes, these did not even happen, so we can't call them significant attacks. And let's talk about what's necessary to end the problem of terrorism, to stop people like Mr. Al-Awlaki. We have found through expert after expert that military force is not the way, the constructive way to address the problem of terrorism. We just had again in February of this year 2 of our top intelligence people testifying before Congress, answering the question of Senator Inhofe, do we have Al-Qaeda on the run? Those were his words. Are they about to end? And we've been bombing this organization using missile strikes since 2001, well before. In 1998, of course, President Clinton tried military force. And the answer to the question of the senator was no. They are not on the run, and they are not about to end. The organization is morphing and growing. Today's New York Times has a story about Al-Qaeda moving to Syria because they have so many potential recruits there. So, looking at a question of necessity, is military force going to get you your protective goal, your legal and legitimate goal? We don't have the evidence for it. Counterterrorism experts tell us time and again, military force is not the way to address a problem of terrorism. And proportionality? The president has on his kill list these individuals he's trying to kill to make America safer, about 24 people. Some people have been killed, and he's added a few more, but it's never really been more than a couple of dozen. And yet, we've killed over 4,000 people to kill a couple of dozen. So I'm not seeing the president's arguments, either in terms of self-defense or in terms of consent, as being anywhere close to what we would need for these killings. The U.S. legal position is simply untenable as a matter of law, and even as a matter of policy. And now I want to talk about some of the unintended negative consequences that have been growing in addition to what many of you already know, how hated we are in places like Pakistan, how we are encouraging people to join militant groups and so on. But we're seeing that other countries, certain other countries, want to use drones in the same way that the U.S. has been using drones. In September of 2013, the New York Times carried a front page story saying that China was hacking U.S. Companies in order to get our drone secrets. China has apparently targeted companies that have developed U.S. drone technology with considerable success. Chinese officials this month sent a drone near disputed islands administered by Japan, debated using a weaponized drone last year to kill a criminal suspect in Myanmar, and sold homemade drones resembling the Predator, the American model, to other countries for less than $1 million each. The U.S. has set the precedent of using military force in situations that prior to 9/11, the U.S. would have used law enforcement. As a result, the legal and ethical barriers to resort to significant violence are being eroded. The U.S., I maintain, is in the best position to slow this development by getting back into compliance with its legal obligations. Only then will it be in a position to protest China's conduct or the conduct of other states. Indeed, to date, the U.S. is using its ersatz arguments not to stop other countries from using drones or getting drones and using them the same way, but rather to underpin new weapons developments, including, let me turn next to cyber weapons. Apparently in 2009, 2010, the U.S. and Israel infected Iranian computers with malware known as the Stuxnet worm. It was the first use of a computer program to do significant physical damage by one state against another. The U.S. has no legal right to damage Iran. Iran has not attacked the United States. It has not violated a treaty with the United States. The only violation of international law that you can directly charge Iran with today is violating the UN Security Council's resolution to open their nuclear sites to IAEA weapons inspectors, and the Iranians have opened their to much greater IAEA weapons inspection in the last 2 months. But the U.S., in using and developing this Stuxnet worm, didn't just do damage within Iran. Over 40% of the computers that were damaged by the Stuxnet worm were outside of Iran. And even more worrying, the Stuxnet worm has now been reverse engineered, and certain individuals, these interesting people who apparently all live in their parents' basements, have come up with their own new developments based on the Stuxnet. For example, Dooku, which is another virus that can take information out of computers and do considerable damage. And the U.S. itself has come up with another virus called Flame. Flame is also, here's a quote from a researcher, "We believe Flame was written by a different team of programmers but commissioned by the same larger entity. Like Dooku, Flame is an espionage tool. It spreads through Bluetooth, and like Dooku, Flame names many of its processes after American media characters, including Beetlejuice and Jason Bourne." This researcher said, "This is the third such virus we've seen in the past 3 years. It's larger than all of them. The question we should be asking now is how many more such campaigns are out there." Cyber weapons are very difficult to keep secret. Once they're decoded, they can be turned into new weapons. The Stuxnet virus was intended to target facilities with a specific layout. However, it was spread by USB flash drives, and it's now around the globe. Stuxnet spun out of control. Although it was intended to stop Iran's nuclear program, it damaged computers all over the world. And here's the most important insight, I think, from a researcher in the area of cyber security. Quote, "Cyber wars are like boomerangs. It would be advisable for governments not to enter cyber wars because in a boomerang war, there are no winners." The result of both the research from both unmanned aerial vehicles or drones and cyber weapons is now being added to, built upon, by researchers trying to come up with, if they have not already done so, the fully autonomous robotic weapons. The advent of robots with computer programs that can learn is triggering really a new and very important and intense discussion on the law and ethics of weapons. Advances in artificial intelligence mean, as I explained before, that once a robot is constructed and programmed, it will be able to make the decision to attack without additional human intervention. These attacks could occur years after the computer is programmed, far from the place where it was set into the world. The parties to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons have begun a process in 2013 to study the fully autonomous robotic weapons, killer robots, as the first step toward a new protocol to control or even prohibit such weapons. In April 2013, United Nations Special Rapporteur Christoph Heinz called for a moratorium on moving beyond the design stage of the development of fully autonomous weapons, pending the formation of a panel of experts to articulate a policy for the international community. And I'm very happy to say that the Holy See, which is a party to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, did state at the meeting in November of parties to the treaty that the Holy See fully supports this investigation of killer robots and is in support of a moratorium pending that investigation. And I hope, of course, afterwards. Well, I don't have as much time as I would like with you, so I'm going to skip ahead to, I think, the question that's on so many people's minds, which is, why are we engaged in all this killing and in the invention of new ways to kill that are truly more terrifying than anything we've seen before? And I think what might explain the growing interest in using force, military force, in ways that we would never have done so before 9/11, outside areas of combat hostilities against countries that have not harmed the United States, has something to do with the technology itself. That the technology is leading to decisions to kill in situations where without it, a non-lethal approach would have been taken. In 2010, I was speaking at the Air Force's Air University, and one of the pilots in the audience said to me that maybe it's the case that President Obama and President Bush don't really see the drone as a military weapon, that it's really not like killing in the way that a B-52 bomber kills or the 82nd Airborne kills. And that may be true, and there's some evidence for that. You might remember when the U.S. was involved in the Libyan conflict in 2011, President Obama did not go to Congress after we were engaged in military force there for over 60 days, as the War Powers Resolution requires. And his legal advisor, Harold Koh, former dean of the Yale Law School, told Congress that we were only using drones in Libya, and that was not the same as having military force involved in the hostilities. So I think the ease with which and the nature of this technology that doesn't involve our own nationals being in harm's way is seducing our leaders into thinking this is not really war and doesn't really have to be justified under the wartime rules that I've been discussing with you. In a report done by the United Kingdom about drones in particular, the authors raised this very concern that UAV technology itself is reducing barriers to killing. Let me quote from their report. One of the contributory factors in controlling and limiting aggressive policy is the risk to one's own forces. For example, the recent extensive use of unmanned aircraft over Pakistan and Yemen may already herald a new era. That these activities are exclusively carried out by unmanned aircraft, even though very capable manned aircraft are available, and that the use of ground troops in harm's way has been avoided, suggests that the use of force is totally a function of the existence of an unmanned capability. It is unlikely a similar scale of force would be used if this capability were not available. A national leader knows he can deploy drones or cyber weapons or robots without his own citizens coming home in body bags. And this fact plainly makes the decision to kill easier for political reasons, especially in the United States, where some of us still well remember the nightly body count of U.S. service members coming home from Vietnam. We know from military psychologists and from studies of killing in war that, in fact, distance is another factor in making it easier to kill with drones. Distance in terms of psychological, cultural, emotional. Colonel Grossman, in his book on killing, focuses on the person who actually pulls the trigger, and he says, or operates the joystick on a missile. He says that the distance factor could impact the decision and makes it easier, and we see the more distance, mechanical or otherwise, the more likely it is that a person will take a shot. Well, this distance factor, I think, can impact everyone involved in the kill decision, including whole societies that are supporting such killing. In the United States, there are many indications that killing with drones has a high level of acceptance. And indeed, the acceptance is so high that Americans even joke about killing with drones. The Bush and Obama administrations have presented killing with drones or cyber weapons or the future robot killers as precise and even imperative, and so morally unproblematic that we can joke about it. Yet moral philosophers teach that the taking of a human life may only be justified to protect a human life. In other words, the exceptional right to resort to lethal force rests squarely on a moral justification of necessity. In armed conflict hostilities, only a reasonable necessity to kill is accepted. But in peacetime, outside armed conflict hostilities, killing must be related to saving a life immediately. And outside armed conflict hostilities, there is no right, no tolerance of killing bystanders. International law on killing remains closely tied to these fundamental moral insights. Given the political and psychological lures to killing with drones and other means, international law specialists should be alert to whether the current law on lethal operations is adequate, rather than loosening the rules and looking for ways to justify this killing. My argument to you tonight is that the rules should be strictly applied to counterbalance the seductive quality of new technology. Returning to close compliance with the rules will likely require a rejection of realist motives for killing to project an image of strength, or killing to send a message or of retribution. And really, neither is moral or lawful. In conclusion, the post-9/11 decade has shown general acceptance among American officials when it comes to killing persons with drones far from armed conflict hostilities. Such killing risks no American lives, and the price tag is considerably lower than when using manned aircraft, let alone ground troops. However, since 2002, Americans have heard that it is legal to kill people far from hostilities, that it's clever to use a cyber weapon, that it's acceptable to invent a killer robot. And yet, this is so distant from our fundamental moral beliefs. Despite 12 and a half years of this killing, we have very little to show, except the loss of our stature as a leader in international law and as a country that really speaks from fundamental moral principle. I am very hopeful about Pope Francis's meeting with President Obama. I am hoping that the Pope will speak in this way to him, to persuade him to find peaceful means to resolve the world's disputes, to take this episode involving Ukraine and to show how weakened the U.S. has become in being able to deliver a message of compliance with international law and compliance with fundamental principle and honest value when we ourselves come from such a weakened point. I asked Father David beforehand if it would be appropriate in this space to conclude these remarks with a prayer. And I know not everyone here would want to pray, but maybe you would join us at least in a moment of silence and in this prayer for Pope Francis. Lord, source of eternal life and truth, give to your shepherd Francis a spirit of courage and right judgment, and a spirit of knowledge and love. By governing with fidelity those entrusted to his care, may he, as successor to the Apostle Peter and vicar of Christ, build your church into a sacrament of unity, love, and peace for all the world. We ask this through Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen.
And now we have questions.
Yeah, so we have time for about 15 minutes of questions. And we would pick up